In today's episode, you'll learn how to teach your listeners how to rate, review, and subscribe to your podcast. Welcome to Podcast and Q&A, where you learn the best tips and strategies to launch, grow, and monetize your show. Podcast reviews are one of the primary ways that you can hear back from your listeners, whether it's to find out what they like about your show or to receive valuable insight into what they think about your show. Reviews can also provide you constructive criticism into ways that you can tweak and improve your show. Ratings can serve the same purpose, but they also are a great source of motivation and validation, because at the end of the day, who doesn't like to be told they're doing a great job? And encouraging your listeners to subscribe to your podcast benefits them by keeping them in the loop and aware of any time that you share new content, and it benefits you by cultivating a dedicated and consistent listenership. Now, most podcast hosts assume that their listeners know how to do all of this, but more often than not, that's not the case. So in today's video, you'll learn how to teach your listeners how to rate, review, and subscribe to your podcast. When it comes to podcast ratings and review, the two that matter the most are Apple Podcasts for iOS devices and Podchaser for Android users. Let's start with Apple Podcasts. The first thing you'll want to instruct your listeners to do is to find your show in Apple Podcasts. Go to the podcast page and scroll all the way to the bottom where the ratings and review section is. There'll be an option for them to leave a rating out of 5 stars and a written review. I recommend that you encourage your listeners to leave both. And when it comes to Podchaser, you'll want to go ahead and find your podcast on the Podchaser website and put a link to that in your show notes. Instruct your listeners to click that link and then leave a review on your Podchaser page. And when it comes to subscribing to a podcast, every platform has a different subscribe button. Whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google, or Spotify, or whatever else, there's a different subscribe button for every platform. I recommend telling your listeners to find that subscribe button on the podcast app that they use. And remind them, subscribing to a podcast is free and they'll get new episodes when they come out. Now that you've learned what to say to your listeners, let's share some best strategies on how to incorporate these call to actions in your content. Remind your listeners to take these actions in the intro or maybe the outro of your show. Keep it brief and casual, and make it really easy on your listeners to take these actions by incorporating links to your Apple Podcast page or your Podchaser page in your show notes. Make it to where all they have to do is click a link to leave that rating and review. And one last thing, remember, reviews don't impact your ranking in Apple Podcasts and aren't one of the criteria for the new and noteworthy section. But they do provide a written testimony from people who have experienced your podcast, and who knows, it might be enough to sway a potential new listener to give your show a shot.
Thanks for listening to Podcast and Q&A. If you have a question that you would like us to answer on a future episode of the show, just go to speakpipe.com/Buzzsprout or click the link in the show notes to leave us a brief audio message. Make sure you're subscribed to the Buzzsprout YouTube channel to watch future episodes of Podcast and Q&A, or subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast listening app. That's it for today. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep podcasting.